All right, welcome back to the deep dive. For this one, you guys sent in a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff, actually, all about sugar.
Hmm.
And it's something that we all, I think, have a pretty complex relationship with. So we've got, articles from health websites. We've got some deep dives into actual reviews of scientific literature.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to navigate through all of that and give you the most
Okay.
important takeaways of what happens when we eat too much sugar, give you a really clear understanding, cut through any conflicting information,
Exactly.
and just give you the highlights of what this means for your health.
I think that's key, isn't it? Because there's so much information out there.
Yeah.
It's really about making sense of it all and kind of applying it to everyday life, right?
Totally. So one thing that really
Yeah.
jumped out at me right away was the statistic from one of the articles that said the average adult in the U.S. consumes 17 teaspoons of added sugar every single day. So, when you think about it, a 2,000-calorie diet, that's 14%
Yeah.
of total calories just from added sugar. The guidelines suggest keeping that below 10%.
Right. Right.
So it's pretty eye-opening.
It really is. I mean, that's a lot of sugar sneaking in there. And I think one of the things that these sources highlight is how much of that can come from sugar-sweetened drinks.
Totally.
Those sodas, those sweetened juices.
Yeah.
How often do we just, grab one without really thinking about,
Yeah.
what's in it?
And those drinks in particular, they're often loaded with fructose.
Right.
Which, that's where it gets kind of interesting because one of the articles was talking about how fructose, unlike, say, glucose, which we get from starchy foods, fructose doesn't really signal fullness in the same way.
That's fascinating, isn't it? It's almost like fructose has this way of kind of tricking the body, tricking your brain into wanting more,
Yeah.
maybe even more so than glucose. And then there's some research that suggests that this high fructose intake could actually lead to something called leptin resistance.
Oh.
Have you heard of this before?
I have, but explain it to the listeners.
So think of leptin as this hormone that basically acts as a signal, right? Your fat cells release leptin, and it travels to your brain, and it's like, hey, brain, we're full here. We've had enough. But when you develop leptin resistance, it's almost like your brain isn't hearing that message as clearly anymore.
Wow.
So you might continue to feel hungry even though you've actually consumed enough calories.
Wow. So it's not just that these drinks are empty calories, they're actually messing with our hormones,
Exactly.
making us feel less satisfied.
That's a great way to put it.
And then there's also the connection to that deeper belly fat, right?
Yes, absolutely. We often hear about visceral fat.
Right.
And it's that fat that really accumulates around your organs deep within your abdomen. And consuming a lot of these sugar-sweetened beverages has been linked to an increase in this type of fat. And the problem with visceral fat is it's not just, an aesthetic concern.
Right.
It's really linked to a higher risk of serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and heart disease.
That's a huge one.
Yeah, absolutely. It really impacts your metabolic health.
Yeah. Speaking of heart health, the sources really dug into that, and it's a big concern because heart disease is still the leading cause of death worldwide.
It's sobering, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what the sources really point to is that there's a pretty clear link between diets high in sugar and an increased risk of heart disease.
Right. And it's not just an indirect thing, right?
Right.
High sugar leads to obesity, and obesity can lead to heart.
Well, yes, that's part of it.
Yeah.
When we look at the bigger picture, high sugar diets can contribute to a lot of the key risk factors for heart disease. So we've touched on obesity, but it also increases inflammation throughout the body.
Right.
It can elevate your triglyceride levels, which is a type of fat found in your blood. It can raise your blood sugar levels, and it can also increase your blood pressure. So all of these things are major risk factors for heart disease.
But then there's also a more direct way, right?
There is.
That sugar can kind of mess with our arteries.
What's fascinating here is the link between high sugar intake, particularly from those sugary drinks we talked about, and something called atherosclerosis. So think of atherosclerosis as this gradual buildup of plaque inside your arteries, right? It's like this fatty gunk that builds up along the artery walls, and it makes the arteries narrower and harder, which then restricts blood flow.
So one of the studies you sent was pretty big, over 25,000 adults.
Right.
And it found that people who consumed more added sugar had a greater risk of developing heart disease and also having coronary problems.
It's a pretty significant finding when you think about the number of people involved, right?
Yeah. And then it's not just heart disease itself, it's also stroke, right?
Exactly. That same study found that having more than 8 servings of sugar-sweetened beverages per week was linked to a higher risk of stroke.
Wow.
So it makes you stop and think about those everyday choices, doesn't it?
Totally. Like, I think it's easy to forget just how much sugar is packed into a single drink.
Right.
Like, the article mentioned that a 12-ounce can of soda, like a regular can,
Right?
has like 37 grams of sugar, like 155 calories.
Wow.
That's almost the recommended daily limit for some people.
It's easy to forget, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
almost like it's hidden in plain sight.
Totally. So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about acne.
Okay.
Might not seem immediately obvious how this is connected to sugar,
Right.
but the sources pointed to a pretty strong link.
What's interesting here is this connection between diets high in refined carbohydrates
Yeah.
and an increased likelihood of developing acne. And it really comes down to how these types of foods affect our blood sugar levels.
So basically, foods that have a high glycemic index, like a lot of processed sweets, they cause a much quicker spike in blood sugar.
Right, compared to foods that are digested more slowly.
Yeah, and so this rapid spike, it's like it sets off this chain reaction
Exactly.
that can lead to breakouts.
When you eat those sugary foods, you get this quick increase in both your blood sugar and insulin levels.
Yeah.
And it's really that surge in insulin that can then trigger an increase in the production of hormones called androgens.
Right.
And these androgens, they can increase oil production in your skin,
Mm-hmm.
and they also promote inflammation, which, as you know, are major factors in the development of acne.
And there's actually evidence that seems to back this up, right?
There is.
Like, diets that are lower in high glycemic index foods are often associated with less acne.
Yes.
And then the opposite is true for diets that are high in these foods.
One study in particular that I found really interesting, it involved over 24,000 participants. And they found a link between the consumption of things like fatty and sugary products,
Yeah.
sugary drinks, and even milk with current acne in adults.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It is. It really suggests that our diet plays a pretty significant role in skin health, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. So, okay, let's talk about type 2 diabetes. It's obviously a huge health issue, and unfortunately, it's becoming more and more common around the world.
Yeah, it's a global health concern, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the sources were careful to point out that no single study definitively proves that sugar directly causes diabetes.
Right.
But the connections are strong. It's more about how excess sugar intake can kind of increase your risk indirectly over time.
Okay, so what's the biggest indirect factor there?
Well, I think we can all agree that eating large amounts of sugar can contribute to weight gain.
Yeah.
And an increase in overall body fat. And these are considered to be some of the strongest risk factors for developing type 2 diabetes.
Right. And beyond just the weight itself, it's also about how our body processes sugar over time.
Exactly. Exactly. So insulin resistance is a key factor here.
Yeah.
When we consume sugar, our body releases insulin. And insulin's job is to help regulate blood sugar levels. But if we're constantly bombarding our body with sugar, over time, our cells can actually become less responsive to insulin.
Right.
And that's what we call insulin resistance. So essentially, insulin isn't working as effectively as it should.
Yeah.
And this can lead to elevated blood sugar levels, which, as we know, significantly increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
And the research on sugar-sweetened beverages in particular, and the risk of diabetes seems to be pretty consistent, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
There have been many studies that have shown that people who regularly consume sugar-sweetened beverages have a higher likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
One study that I remember followed people over a period of 4 years.
Yeah.
And they found that even a small increase in the consumption of these drinks, including 100% fruit juice, was associated with a higher risk of diabetes.
It just shows you, those liquid calories, they really sneak up on you.
They do.
All right, so let's get into a topic that's a little bit more complex and where the research is still ongoing.
Okay.
And that's the potential link between sugar and cancer.
So, this is definitely an area where scientists are still working to fully understand the picture.
Yeah.
But there are a few ways in which high sugar intake might contribute to an increased risk of certain cancers.
So again, the most direct connection seems to be through weight gain, wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We know that diets high in sugary foods and beverages can lead to obesity.
Right,
And obesity is a well-established risk factor for several types of cancer.
right. But then there are also these other biological processes that could be at play, right?
Right. So, we talked about inflammation earlier. High sugar diets can promote this state of chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body,
Yeah.
and they can also contribute to insulin resistance, which we discussed in relation to diabetes.
Right.
Both chronic inflammation and insulin resistance have been implicated in cancer development.
The sources mentioned a big review
Yes.
that looked at a ton of studies on sugar and cancer.
Yeah, they pulled together a lot of research on this.
So what were the main takeaways from that?
Well, they found that in some studies that looked specifically at added sugar, and in a larger number of studies that looked at sugary foods and beverages,
Mm-hmm.
there was an observed increase in the risk of cancer associated with higher levels of sugar intake.
Okay.
Now, it's important to note that the extent of that risk varied across studies,
Yeah.
which does highlight how complex this relationship is.
Right. Were there any types of cancer in particular that seemed to be more strongly linked to sugar?
There were a few that kind of stood out. For instance, one study that focused on men found that there was a higher risk of prostate cancer associated with a greater consumption of sugary drinks over about a 9-year period.
Okay.
And another study found a potential link between esophageal cancer and higher intakes of sucrose, which is table sugar,
Yeah.
and sweetened desserts and beverages.
It's really interesting.
It is. It's definitely an area that requires more research.
Totally. Let's talk about mental well-being,
Okay.
because this is so crucial to overall health, and it seems like sugar might play a role here too.
Absolutely. And I think we all intuitively know that,
Yeah.
what we eat can influence how we feel.
Yeah.
But the sources really delved into the link between excess sugar consumption and an increased risk of depression
Right.
and mood changes.
Yeah. The sources even mentioned some potential links to like anxiety and other cognitive and emotional problems.
Yeah, there's been research that has found associations between higher sugar consumption and things like cognitive impairment,
Yeah.
potential memory problems, and a range of emotional disorders,
Mhm.
including anxiety and depression.
So how do scientists explain that? Like, what are some of the theories behind this connection between sugar and our mood?
Well, one of the main theories centers around inflammation.
Okay.
We've talked about how high sugar diets can promote chronic inflammation,
Yeah.
and this inflammation can actually affect brain function.
Okay.
Another theory is that insulin resistance, which again we've discussed quite a bit,
Yeah.
might also have an impact on brain function.
So it's not just about our physical health. Insulin resistance is also impacting our brain.
Exactly. And then there's the possibility that a high sugar intake might actually disrupt the signaling of dopamine in the brain.
Oh, wow.
Dopamine is this neurotransmitter that plays a really important role in things like pleasure and reward.
Right.
And so if that signaling gets disrupted, it could potentially contribute to mood problems.
So it's not just theoretical. There's actually evidence from studies in humans that back this up, right?
Yes, absolutely. There have been studies that have shown this link.
Oh.
For instance, one study that followed a large group of people over time found that men who consumed higher amounts of sugar daily were more likely to develop depression compared to those who had lower sugar intakes.
Wow.
And there's an older study that looked at a huge group of women,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they also found a greater risk of depression in those who reported the highest levels of added sugar consumption.
It's crazy to think, like what we eat can impact something as personal as our mental state.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that food and mood are interconnected.
Yeah, totally. So, okay, let's think about something a little bit more visible.
Okay.
Skin aging. Getting wrinkles is a natural part of life.
Right.
But the sources suggest that sugar might actually speed up this process.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we all know we can't avoid wrinkles completely,
Right.
but it seems that making poor dietary choices could actually make them worse and contribute to faster skin aging.
And these sources pointed to something called AGE. Yes.
Advanced glycation end products?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, that sounds kind of scary. What are they?
So AGEs are these harmful compounds
Hmm.
that are formed when sugar in your bloodstream reacts with proteins in your body.
Okay.
And scientists believe that these AGEs play a pretty significant role in skin aging.
So how do they actually, affect our skin?
Well, they can damage collagen and elastin,
Okay.
which are two really important proteins in our skin.
Right.
Collagen and elastin are what give our skin that elasticity, that firmness,
Right.
that helps it stay youthful and smooth.
Okay.
When AGs damage collagen and elastin, it can cause the skin to lose its firmness and start to sag, which can lead to more wrinkles.
So it's like sugar is literally like making our skin age faster.
Well, the sources did point out that we need more research specifically in humans
Okay.
to really fully understand how strong this connection is.
Right, but it's certainly something to think about.
Absolutely.
So let's go even deeper.
Okay.
Let's talk about cellular aging.
Because the sources suggest that high sugar consumption might even be contributing to our cells aging faster.
So this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And it has to do with these structures called telomeres.
Okay, I've heard of telomeres, but remind everyone what they are.
So think of telomeres as these protective caps that sit at the very ends of our chromosomes.
Okay.
And chromosomes, they're like these little packages that contain our DNA, our genetic information.
Right.
And telomeres help to protect these chromosomes from getting damaged or sticking together.
So how does sugar fit into all of this?
Well, as we age, our telomeres naturally shorten.
Okay.
That's just a normal part of the aging process of our cells.
Yeah.
However, research suggests that certain lifestyle factors, and this includes diet, might actually accelerate that shortening.
Right.
And, consuming high amounts of sugar seems to be one of those factors.
And there was a study that looked at young children, right?
Yes, it was a pilot study.
Yeah.
Looking at preschool-aged children.
Yeah.
And they found a link between increased consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and shorter telomere length.
Really?
Which is a marker of cellular aging.
So it's like even from a young age,
Yeah.
our diet is impacting aging at like a cellular level.
It's really fascinating, and it kind of highlights the importance of thinking about long-term health consequences.
Oh, totally, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about energy. We all know that feeling like you have something sugary, you get this quick burst of energy, and then
crash.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Totally.
Yeah.
So the sources explain why this happens, and it all comes down to how sugar messes with our blood sugar and insulin levels, right?
Exactly. Foods that are high in added sugar cause this really rapid increase in both blood sugar and insulin.
Yeah.
And that initial spike is what gives you that temporary feeling of energy.
Right.
But the problem is sugary foods and drinks often lack the other components that help to sustain your energy levels over time, like protein and healthy fats.
Yeah.
So after that initial sugar rush, your blood sugar plummets.
Right.
And that leads to that feeling of fatigue,
Yeah.
that energy crash.
And this constant up and down can't be good for us.
It's not ideal.
Yeah.
Those constant swings in blood sugar lead to these fluctuations in energy throughout the day. And there was a large review of studies that found that consuming carbohydrates, especially sugar, can actually lower your alertness within about an hour.
Wow.
And increase feelings of fatigue within 30 minutes of eating them.
So what's a better way to get energy?
So the sources recommend choosing carbohydrate sources that are naturally lower in added sugar and higher in fiber.
Okay.
And pairing your carbohydrates with some protein or healthy fats.
Oh, okay. Give me an example.
So instead of just having, say, a piece of fruit,
yeah.
try having an apple with a handful of almonds.
Okay.
So the fiber in the apple and the protein and fat in the almonds will help to balance out the natural sugars in the fruit.
And that'll give you more sustained energy.
Exactly. It helps to slow down the absorption of sugar into your bloodstream.
Okay.
And prevent those drastic spikes and crashes.
All right. So let's talk about our liver now.
Okay.
Because it's a pretty important organ. It processes everything we eat.
It's like the body's filter, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
And the sources discuss this connection between high fructose intake and fatty liver disease.
Yeah, so non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NFLD.
NFLD.
It's a condition where there's an excessive buildup of fat in the liver.
Right.
And high fructose intake has been linked to an increased risk of this condition.
Okay.
And it's because fructose is primarily metabolized by the liver.
Okay, so unlike glucose,
right,
which can be used by lots of different cells in the body, fructose mainly gets broken down by the liver.
Exactly.
Okay.
And, the liver can convert fructose into energy, or it can store it as glycogen, which is a form of stored glucose. But there's a limit to how much glycogen the liver can store. And any excess fructose gets turned into fat. So if we're constantly flooding our liver with fructose,
Yeah.
it can lead to this buildup of fat.
And there was that mouse study that really highlighted this.
Yeah, there's a study where they fed mice a high fructose diet for a prolonged period of time,
Mhm.
and those mice showed signs of liver damage, inflammation,
Wow.
tumor development, and fatty liver compared to a control group.
So it's not just like a little bit of extra fat.
No, it can lead to some pretty serious issues.
And then the study also suggested something interesting, right?
Yeah, it seemed like fructose that's consumed in liquid form, like through beverages,
Yeah.
might be more likely to cause fatty liver than the fructose that occurs naturally in foods,
Okay.
and that consuming large amounts all at once might be worse than spreading it out throughout the day.
So it's not just the fructose itself, it's also how we consume it.
Exactly. It seems that the form and the timing can play a role.
And there's evidence from human studies as well, right?
Yes, there's a study that looked at over 5,900 adults,
Oh.
and they found that people who drank sugar-sweetened beverages daily had a much higher risk of developing NAFLD.
Than those who didn't.
Exactly.
So it really does seem like, that fructose, especially in those sugary drinks, is putting a burden on our liver.
And, beyond these major issues we've discussed,
Yeah.
there are a few other health risks associated with too much sugar.
Okay, what else?
Well, there's an increased risk of kidney disease, possibly due to higher levels of uric acid and damage to those tiny blood vessels in the kidneys from high blood sugar.
Yeah.
And we all know it negatively affects dental health, leading to cavities.
Of course.
And then there's an increased risk of gout, again, because of those elevated uric acid levels.
Right.
And there's even some emerging research that suggests a potential link to faster cognitive decline.
So it's not just our physical health, sugar is impacting our brain health as well.
That's what the research is pointing towards.
Wow. It's really a pretty comprehensive list of potential downsides.
It's not something to take lightly.
Okay, so the sources mention this term free sugars,
Yes.
which is like a term used by organizations like the WHO and SACN.
Right.
So how is that different from just added sugars?
Free sugars is a broader category.
Okay.
It includes all the sugars that are added to foods and drinks during processing, cooking, or at the table.
Right, so that's added sugar.
Right.
Okay.
But it also includes the sugars that are naturally present in things like honey,
Oh,
fruit
chocolate.
juices,
Yeah.
and syrups.
So it's not just what we add, it's also what's already in some of the foods.
Exactly. But it generally doesn't include the sugars that are found naturally within the structure of whole foods.
Right, like a piece of fruit.
Exactly, like the sugars in an apple.
Okay, that makes sense. There's also like a whole historical context to this whole discussion about sugar and its impact on health.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I remember reading about the sugar hypothesis
Yes.
versus the saturated fat theory from decades ago.
Back in the mid-20th century, there was this huge debate about what the main dietary culprit was in diseases like heart disease and obesity.
Yeah.
And a scientist named John Yudkin proposed the sugar hypothesis, suggesting that added sugar was a major problem.
Right.
But the saturated fat and cholesterol theory,
Yeah.
which was promoted by other scientists, ended up getting more attention.
Right, like the low-fat craze.
Exactly. And by the 1980s, the low-fat movement was really taking hold, and concerns about sugar kind of took a back seat.
Yeah, but things have changed, right? Like, our understanding has evolved a lot.
It has, and that's thanks to things like the reevaluation of some older research and new findings from studies like the Framingham Heart Study.
Yeah, the Framingham study has been going on forever.
It has. It's provided a wealth of data.
So what did it find about sugar?
Well, it really helped to bring sugar back into the spotlight, Its findings linked frequent consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages
Yeah.
to increased fat accumulation in the liver
Oh, wow.
and negative changes in cholesterol and triglyceride levels.
And they call that dyslipidemia.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a condition that can contribute to heart disease.
So it's really like reaffirming that sugar is a major player in these health problems.
Right, and it's not just about the fat, it's about these other metabolic changes that are happening in the body.
Yeah. So let's look at the trends in sugar consumption over time.
Okay.
Have we been eating more or less sugar over the decades?
Well, what the sources show is that the latter part of the 20th century saw a huge increase in the amount of refined sugars and high fructose corn syrup that were added to our food supply.
Right.
And this, as we've discussed, coincided with a rise in rates of obesity and related diseases.
Yeah, and it's scary to think how much sugar is probably hidden in, like, processed foods that we're not even aware of.
Absolutely. It's everywhere.
Yeah. So what about now? Are we eating less sugar?
Well, there has been a modest decline in added sugar intake in some populations in the early 21st century.
Okay.
But global consumption is still high.
Yeah.
And sugar-sweetened beverages continue to be a major source of sugar for a lot of people.
It's so hard to resist, you know?
They're designed to be appealing.
Totally. Okay, so given all this information,
Yeah.
what do, like, the big health organizations recommend?
Well, organizations like the WHO, the AHA, the NHS,
Okay.
they all generally recommend limiting added or free sugars to no more than 5 to 10% of your daily calories.
Okay, so that's a pretty specific guideline.
It is. It gives you a target to aim for.
Yeah. So one thing I found interesting is that in some places, sugar consumption has gone down a little bit,
Right.
but obesity rates are still going up.
It is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah, so how do the sources explain that?
Well, they offer a few possible explanations.
Okay.
One is that there might be a lag time,
Yeah.
between when dietary changes happen and when we see those changes reflected in population health outcomes.
So it takes time.
It does. It takes time for those changes to work their way through.
Okay.
And another factor could be the increasing use of artificial sweeteners and sugar alternatives.
Right.
We're still learning about the long-term health effects of those.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about physical inactivity,
Yeah.
which plays a huge role in weight management.
Totally.
And then, when we look at studies that focus on total sugar intake and obesity,
Mm-hmm.
the results have been mixed.
Okay. Why is that?
It could be due to differences in study design
Okay.
or limitations with self-reported dietary data.